The early morning sun cast a golden glow over the quiet suburban neighborhood where birds chirped, dogs barked lazily from their porches, and the hum of sprinklers filled the air. Everything seemed peaceful until the unmistakable rumble of a tractor echoed down the street. Corinne Thompson, a middle-aged woman with perfectly styled hair and an ever-present scowl, nearly choked on her organic green tea. She had moved here to escape the chaos of city life, and in her mind, that meant escaping anything remotely rural. Since arriving, she'd battled the sights and sounds of her new surroundings, filing complaints about kids playing outside and the smell of freshly cut grass. But this was a new level of unacceptable. Slamming her cup on the patio table, she stormed to the front yard, her slippers slapping against the pavement, her sharp eyes locking onto the approaching tractor as if it were a tank invading her pristine world. The sight of the massive green machine creeping down the street made her blood boil. A man sat at the wheel, relaxed, one hand on the steering wheel, the other tipping his hat slightly to a neighbor who waved. Corinne's outrage exploded. Hey, you, what do you think you're doing?" She screeched, marching to the edge of her perfectly manicured lawn. The tractor slowed to a stop, and the driver, a rugged-looking farmer in his mid-40s, turned his head toward her, his expression calm, amused even, as if he'd dealt with people like her before. "I'm just taking my tractor down to my field," he said, his voice carrying an unmistakable country twang. "Nothing to worry about." Corinne's jaw tightened. "Oh, there is something to worry about. This is a residential street. You can't just drive farm equipment through here like it's some dirt road in the middle of nowhere." The farmer adjusted his hat, glancing down at the pavement beneath his tractor's thick tires. "Far as I can tell, this is a public road, and farm vehicles are legally allowed on public roads." Corinne's nostrils flared. She spent her life in places where rules were rules, where everything was regulated, where someone in charge could fix whatever bothered her. She won arguments against store managers, restaurant staff, and HOA board members. She wasn't about to lose to some guy who thought he could drive a farm machine past her house. "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "I live here. I have a right to peace and quiet. You could be damaging the road with those huge wheels. What if a child runs out in front of you? This thing is a safety hazard." The farmer leaned on the steering wheel, giving her a patient smile. "I'm moving at about 5 miles an hour. A kid could outrun me without breaking a sweat." That answer only enraged her further. She placed her hands on her hips, her voice rising. "I'm calling the police. You can't just do whatever you want. I know my rights, and I know this is illegal." The farmer shrugged, unfazed. "Go ahead. I'll wait." Corinne whipped out her phone, stabbing the screen as she dialed 911. She put the call on speaker so the farmer would hear every word of her righteous complaint. Yes, I need an officer sent to my neighborhood immediately. There's a large, dangerous vehicle on the road, some kind of tractor blocking traffic and creating a safety hazard." The dispatcher remained professional. "Is the vehicle moving erratically? Is there an emergency?" "It's driving through a neighborhood," Corinne shrieked. "It's illegal. This is a residential area, and this thing is not safe." "The driver is refusing to leave." The farmer rested his chin in his hand, watching the scene unfold like it was a mildly entertaining show. The dispatcher's voice stayed calm. "I'll send an officer to check, but I need to inform you that farm vehicles are generally allowed on public roads if they're traveling safely." Corinne's face turned red. "No, you don't understand. This is an invasion of my peaceful community." Corinne's tirade continued as she clutched her phone, her voice rising with every word. "What if other farmers start driving their tractors here? Are we supposed to just accept that? What's next? Cows in our front yards, chickens running loose?" The farmer chuckled, shaking his head. "Now that be something." Corinne shot him a glare so sharp it could cut steel. "This isn't funny." The dispatcher repeated that an officer would be dispatched and ended the call. Corinne crossed her arms triumphantly. "We'll see what the law has to say about this." The farmer merely adjusted his seat and waited. A few neighbors had started watching from their porches, whispering amongst themselves. Most were used to Corinne's antics, but this was a new level of drama even for her. 10 minutes later, the sound of a police vehicle approaching made Corinne's smug grin widen. "Now you're going to learn that there are rules in this neighborhood," she said, turning to the farmer. The sheriff's car pulled up and a tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped out. His uniform was neat, his posture confident, his expression unreadable as he walked toward the scene. Corinne puffed out her chest. "Officer, thank goodness you're here. I need you to remove this vehicle from our street immediately." The officer took a long look at the tractor, then at the farmer, then at Karen. A slow smile spread across his face. "Well now," he said, adjusting his belt, "that's a fine-looking John Deere 5075E." Karen's face twisted in confusion. What does that have to do with anything?" The officer nodded to the farmer. "That yours?" The farmer grinned. "Sure is," Karen blinked. "Why does that matter? He's breaking the law. This is a residential street." The officer turned to her, still smiling but clearly enjoying himself. "I'm going to need you to calm down, ma'am. I grew up on a farm myself, and I know for a fact that farm vehicles are allowed on public roads as long as he's not blocking traffic or driving recklessly. He's not breaking any law." Karen's entire body stiffened. "That can't be right. He's damaging the road. He's endangering pedestrians. The officer held up a hand. "Ma'am, do you know how many times I've been called out here because of complaints from you?" Karen's mouth snapped shut. The officer sighed. "This man is just doing his job. He's allowed to drive his tractor through here. If you want, I can cite you for wasting emergency resources on a non-issue." Karen's face paled. "I was reporting a public hazard." The officer shook his head. "No, you were complaining about a tractor." The farmer chuckled under his breath. Karen turned on her heel and stormed back into her house, slamming the door behind her. The officer and the farmer exchanged an amused look. "Sorry about that," the officer said. "She's been on a bit of a crusade since she moved in." The farmer shrugged. "Ain't the first time, won't be the last." The officer patted the side of the tractor. "Nice ride, by the way." The farmer grinned. "Appreciate it, officer." As the sheriff returned to his car and the farmer started up his tractor again, the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. But Karen, fuming behind her curtains, wasn't done just yet. She was already thinking of her next move. Officer Dan adjusted his belt as he watched Karen stomp back into her house. He'd been a sheriff in this town for over a decade and had seen his fair share of petty complaints. But Karen Thompson was in a league of her own. Ever since she'd moved in, his department had received an endless stream of calls from her, each one more ridiculous than the last, from kids drawing with chalk on the sidewalk to neighbors grilling too close to her fence. Now she'd outdone herself by calling 911 over a tractor. The farmer, still seated on his tractor, let out a chuckle. "She sure knows how to make a fuss, don't she?" Dan smirked. "You have no idea. She's probably already looking up more things to complain about." Dan had grown up in this town and understood the balance between suburban life and the farming community that had thrived here long before newcomers like Karen arrived. People who came from the city, expecting everything to be perfectly manicured and silent, didn't appreciate the hard work that kept food on their tables. Karen, peeking from behind her living room curtains with narrowed eyes, couldn't believe what she was seeing. The officer wasn't just dismissing her, he was friendly with the farmer, even complimenting his tractor like it was some prized possession. Her hands clenched into fists. This wasn't over. She refused to let this nonsense stand. Determined to put an end to what she saw as a personal attack, she marched back outside. "Officer, I want your badge number," she demanded, her voice sharp. Dan sighed. "Ma'am, I haven't done anything wrong." "You're refusing to uphold the law," she shot back. "I'll be reporting you to your superior for failing to protect the citizens of this neighborhood." Dan gave her a tired look. "With all due respect, I am the superior." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish. That wasn't the response she'd expected. She'd assumed she could intimidate him into siding with her by threatening a complaint, but now she realized she was dealing with someone who wouldn't be bullied so easily. "Well then, I'll take this higher," she snapped. "I'll go to the mayor, I'll contact the local government. You people think you can just let farm equipment roam the streets like this is the 1800s. This is unacceptable." Dan folded his arms. "You're welcome to file any complaint you like, but I can assure you the law is on his side." Karen's eye twitched. She wasn't about to let this slide. If the police wouldn't do anything, she'd handle it herself. She turned on her heel and stormed back inside, this time with a plan forming in her mind. The farmer watched her go, shaking his head. "She ain't done, is she?" Dan chuckled. "Not by a long shot." Inside her house, Karen opened her laptop and started typing furiously, scouring local government websites for anything she could use against the farmer. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she searched for zoning laws, vehicle restrictions, anything that might prove tractors had no place on her street. After nearly an hour, she found something, a law regarding large commercial vehicles in residential areas. She read the text carefully, her lips curling into a smirk. This was it. If she could prove the tractor fell under this category, she could force the city to ban it from her neighborhood. Grinning, she printed the document and marched back outside, waving it in the air. "Officer, I have proof this man is violating city regulations." Dan raised an eyebrow as he took the paper and read through it. It only took him a few seconds to shake his head. "This here applies to large commercial trucks, not farm equipment." Karen's face turned red. But it's huge, it takes up half the road. How is that not the same thing?" Dan handed the paper back to her. "Tractors are considered farm vehicles, not commercial trucks. The law you're referencing doesn't apply." Karen felt her blood pressure rise. "That's ridiculous." "You're just making up excuses because you don't want to do your job," Dan sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He had more important things to do than argue with a woman determined to bend reality to fit her version of the rules. "I'm going to say this one last time. This man is legally allowed to drive his tractor on this road. If you keep trying to interfere, you're the one who's going to be in trouble for harassing your neighbor." Karen's mouth dropped open. "Harassing me? I'm the victim here." Dan didn't respond. He simply turned back to the farmer and gave him a nod. "You have a good day now." The farmer tipped his hat. "You too, officer." Karen stood frozen, watching as the officer walked back to his car and drove off. Her rage intensified as the farmer put his tractor back in gear and rolled down the street, acting as if nothing had happened. Karen glared at the farmer's retreating figure, her hands shaking with fury. If the police wouldn't do anything, she'd take matters into her own hands. She grabbed her phone and dialed the HOA president. "Hello, this is Karen Thompson, and we have a major issue in the neighborhood," she began, her voice dripping with self-righteous anger. The HOA president, an older man who dealt with her complaints countless times, sighed. "What is it this time, Karen?" "There's a farmer driving his tractor through our streets. It's an eyesore, it's noisy, it's dangerous. We need to put a stop to this immediately." The HOA president took a deep breath, already regretting answering the phone. "Karen, we live near farms. Farmers use tractors. There's nothing we can do about it." Karen gritted her teeth. "That's unacceptable. We need rules. We need to protect our community." The HOA president was done. "Karen, we have rules, and none of them say anything about tractors being banned. If you want to change that, you'll have to get the entire neighborhood to agree." Karen's grip on her phone tightened. "Fine, then I'll get the whole neighborhood involved. We'll see how they feel about farm equipment taking over our streets." Before he could respond, she hung up and stormed back inside, already planning her next move. If she couldn't get the law on her side, she'd rally the neighborhood against the farmer. What she didn't realize was that the neighborhood wasn't exactly on her side. Most people liked the farmer. They appreciated what he did and were more than a little tired of Karen's endless complaints. As she sat at her kitchen table, furiously typing out a message for the neighborhood bulletin board, she was completely unaware that her crusade was about to backfire spectacularly. She drafted a neighborhood-wide email, certain that if she framed her complaint correctly, she could rally enough support to pressure the HOA into action. She used words like safety concern, disruption, and community standards to make it seem like she was advocating for everyone rather than indulging a personal vendetta. She reread her email twice before hitting send, confident the response would be overwhelming. Within minutes, replies started coming in, but they weren't what she'd expected. Some neighbors ignored her message, while others responded with mild amusement. One wrote, "It's a tractor, Karen, calm down." Another said, "You moved next to a farm town. What did you expect?" Karen clenched her jaw as she read through the responses, realizing the neighborhood wasn't taking her side. This was unacceptable. If they wouldn't help her, she'd escalate things on her own. Determined to take action, she decided to gather evidence. She grabbed her phone and stormed outside, standing on her lawn with the camera aimed at the street. She waited until the farmer came through again, his tractor rolling along at its usual slow pace. She hit record and began narrating in the most dramatic tone she could muster. "As you can see, this enormous, dangerous vehicle is tearing through our neighborhood, completely ignoring the safety of children, pets, and homeowners. This is an outrage. We cannot allow our once peaceful community to be overrun by industrial machinery." The farmer glanced over as he passed, raising an eyebrow at the sight of Karen filming him like an investigative journalist exposing a scandal. He let out a chuckle, shaking his head as he continued on his way. Karen gritted her teeth, furious at his lack of concern. She turned the camera back to her face and continued, "I will not rest until something is done about this. We deserve better than this blatant disregard for our rights." Satisfied with her footage, she uploaded it to social media, captioning it, Our peaceful neighborhood is under attack by reckless farm vehicles. Something needs to be done." She sat back, waiting for the flood of outrage and support to roll in. But instead of agreement, the comments were full of mockery. "Karen, it's a tractor, not a monster truck. Reckless, it's literally moving at a snail's pace. Maybe try living somewhere that isn't next to farms if tractors offend you so much. Imagine calling 911 over a tractor, classic Karen move." Her face burned with humiliation as she scrolled through the comments. Karen slammed her phone down on the table, breathing heavily. This wasn't going the way she'd planned. Instead of rallying people to her cause, she turned herself into a joke. If social media and the neighborhood wouldn't take her seriously, she had no choice but to go further. The next morning, she came up with a new strategy. If she couldn't get legal backing or community support, she'd make the farmer's life as inconvenient as possible. She marched outside with a clipboard and a neon vest, standing at the edge of her property like a self-appointed traffic enforcer. Every time the farmer's tractor came down the street, she stepped forward, holding up a hand as if she had the authority to stop him. "You are creating a public disturbance," she shouted. "I am documenting every time you pass through. This will be reported." The farmer sighed, pulling the tractor to a stop. "I'm not doing anything wrong." Karen clicked her pen aggressively, making exaggerated notes on her clipboard. "That's what you say, but the evidence is piling up. You're obstructing traffic." The farmer looked up and down the nearly empty road, then back at her. "Ain't exactly a traffic jam." "You are disturbing the peace," she insisted. "Whose peace?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Far as I can tell, you're the only one complaining." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "You may think this is funny, but I will not be intimidated by you." The farmer let out a slow breath, clearly running out of patience. "I got work to do. You can stand there and write on that clipboard all day if you want, but it ain't gonna change the law." Karen didn't respond. She just narrowed her eyes, watching as the tractor rolled away. If she couldn't stop him legally, she'd make him regret ever driving through her street. That night, she sat in her house, plotting her next move. The next morning, she set up lawn chairs, cones, and caution tape along the road in front of her house, attempting to create a no-tractor zone. She stood proudly with her arms crossed as the farmer approached, waiting to see if he'd dare challenge her authority. He slowed down, rubbing his forehead in disbelief at the sight of what looked like an amateur construction zone. "What in the world is this?" "This is a designated tractor-free zone," Karen said smugly. "Private citizens have the right to take measures to protect their property and their peace," the farmer sighed. "Ma'am, this ain't how the law works." "Prove it," she snapped. He reached for his phone, making a call. Within minutes, Officer Dan pulled up in his squad car, stepping out with an unimpressed expression. Dan took one look at the cones, tape, and Karen's self-righteous stance before letting out a long sigh. "Karen, what are you doing?" he asked, rubbing his temples. "I am exercising my rights," she declared. "If the law won't stop this man, then I will." Dan shook his head. "You can't just block off a public road, Karen." "It's not a public road," she shot back. "It's a residential street, and we have the right to dictate what kinds of vehicles come through here." Dan crossed his arms. "No, you don't. This is county property. You're interfering with lawful passage." Karen's face turned red. "I am doing what the HOA refuses to do. I am standing up for our neighborhood." Dan gestured to the houses around them. "Karen, nobody else cares. In fact, most of your neighbors like this guy." Karen turned and saw a few neighbors watching from their porches, some shaking their heads, others openly laughing at the absurdity of the situation. Dan sighed. "I'm giving you one warning. Take this stuff down and quit interfering with the road, or I'll have to cite you." Karen clenched her fists, furious beyond words. "This isn't over." Dan looked at her with tired eyes. "It really should be." With that, he turned back to his car. The farmer tipped his hat and continued on his way, barely acknowledging Karen's tantrum. As Karen begrudgingly tore down her makeshift roadblock, she burned with resentment. If the law, the community, and the HOA refused to back her, she had only one option left. She'd make this personal. Karen seethed as she tore down the last bit of caution tape from the street. The humiliation of being publicly dismissed by the officer, the farmer, and even her neighbors burning hotter than ever. She spent her life getting her way, bending rules in her favor, making people listen to her complaints. But this was an insult she couldn't ignore. If the law wouldn't help her and the HOA refused to act, she'd make life miserable for that farmer in ways he wouldn't see coming. She stormed back inside and began searching online for every possible nuisance complaint she could file. Noise ordinances, road damage, environmental impact reports, anything she could twist into a legitimate-sounding reason to make his life difficult. After an hour of researching, she found something. A clause about excessive dust being a public hazard. A smug smile spread across her face. If she could claim his tractor was kicking up dust and affecting air quality, she might have a case. The next day, she walked outside at the exact time the farmer usually passed through. Sure enough, the familiar rumble of the tractor echoed down the road. Karen dramatically held up her phone and started coughing loudly, making a big show of fanning the air in front of her, exaggerating each cough as the tractor rolled by at its usual slow pace. As soon as he passed, she turned to the camera with a grave expression. "This is what we have to deal with every single day," she said, her voice dripping with self-righteous anger. "Our air is being contaminated by this reckless farming equipment, and no one is doing anything about it. How are we supposed to live in these conditions?" Satisfied with her performance, she uploaded the video to the local community Facebook page, writing a lengthy post about air pollution in our neighborhood and demanding immediate action. She was certain this time people would have no choice but to take her seriously, but just like before, the responses were not what she expected. "Karen, that's cold dirt. It happens when things move. Lady, you're standing on a paved street. Where's all this dust you're talking about? Are you seriously complaining about a little bit of dirt? You live near farms. This woman is obsessed. Someone get her a hobby." Karen's face turned red as she read through the comments. She couldn't understand how people were so blind to the issue. Was she really the only one who cared about the integrity of their neighborhood? It didn't matter. If people refused to take action, she'd take matters into her own hands. The next morning, she came up with a new strategy. She'd make the farmer feel as unwelcome as possible. Every time he drove past, she'd be outside, standing with her arms crossed, shaking her head disapprovingly. She'd glare at him, muttering under her breath, making sure he saw her disdain. She even enlisted the help of a few equally disgruntled friends who didn't necessarily care about the tractor but were always happy to join Karen in stirring up drama. They stood in a little group on the sidewalk every morning, whispering loudly about how some people had no respect for the community. The farmer, however, didn't seem bothered in the slightest. If anything, he found it amusing. Every time he passed by, he simply tipped his hat with a smile and kept going, unfazed by Karen's theatrics. This only enraged her further. She wanted him to feel the pressure, to feel uncomfortable, to know he wasn't welcome. But instead, he seemed to be enjoying himself. Her frustration reached its peak when she woke up one morning to find an old, rusty tractor decoration placed right across from her house. It was parked on a neighbor's lawn, positioned perfectly so that every time she looked out her window, it was the first thing she saw. It was a direct mockery of her campaign against tractors, and she knew exactly who was responsible. Fuming, she marched across the street to confront her neighbor, an older man who'd lived there for decades. "That thing is an eyesore," she snapped, pointing at the tractor. "You need to remove it immediately." The man leaned on his fence, barely looking up from his newspaper. "That's my property, Karen. I can decorate it however I like." Karen's jaw clenched. "It's lowering property values," the old man chuckled. "Pretty sure that's not how it works." "You're doing this just to spite me," she accused. He shrugged. "Maybe, but I think it adds a nice rustic charm, don't you?" Karen's fists clenched at her sides. No matter where she turned, people were against her. It was infuriating. Determined not to let this go, she called the HOA again, demanding they do something about the growing tractor invasion in the neighborhood. This time, they didn't even pretend to take her seriously. The HOA president sighed and said flatly, "Karen, we're not banning tractors, decorations, or otherwise. Stop wasting our time." That was it, the final straw. If the HOA wouldn't act, the police wouldn't act, and the neighbors refused to support her, she had no choice but to take her complaints directly to the mayor. She spent the afternoon drafting a formal complaint, outlining her many grievances about the tractor, the farmer, and the disruption to the neighborhood's integrity. She printed multiple copies and marched to the local government office, demanding a meeting with the mayor. Unfortunately for her, the mayor had grown up in the town and was well aware of the farming community's importance. When Karen sat down across from him and launched into her tirade, he listened patiently before leaning back in his chair with a smirk. "Karen," he said, his tone calm but firm, "this is a farm town. Farmers have been using these roads long before you moved in, and they'll be using them long after you're gone. I suggest you find something else to complain about." Karen felt her stomach drop. Even the mayor wasn't taking her side. She stood up abruptly, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "This town has no respect for its residents," she huffed. The mayor chuckled. "No, Karen, this town just doesn't have time for nonsense." With nothing left to do, she stormed out of the office, humiliated and defeated. As she drove home, she realized she'd lost. The farmer wasn't going anywhere, the tractor wasn't going anywhere, and worst of all, she'd turned herself into the town laughingstock. That evening, as the sun set and the tractor made its usual slow journey down the street, Karen didn't bother to run outside. She didn't glare, she didn't film. She just sat inside, fuming silently as the realization sank in. She'd lost. But as she stared out her window, watching the farmer pass by, she made a silent vow. This wasn't over, not yet. She sat at her dining table, fingers drumming against the polished wood, staring at a blank notepad. The entire town had turned against her. The police, the HOA, the mayor, even her neighbors had mocked her relentless pursuit of removing the farmer and his tractor from her street. It was the most humiliating defeat she'd ever experienced, but Karen wasn't the type to give up easily. She spent her life getting her way, and she wasn't about to let some small-town farmer and his oversized vehicle ruin the suburban dream she'd envisioned when she moved here. Sipping her chamomile tea, she willed herself to calm down and began listing new ways to make life difficult for the farmer. If she couldn't get the authorities to remove him, she'd make staying in this neighborhood unbearable for him. She considered calling code enforcement every time he passed by, reporting him for anything she could think of, no matter how minor. She thought about filing a noise complaint every morning, even though the tractor barely made more noise than a lawnmower. If she made enough of a nuisance of herself, maybe he'd decide it wasn't worth the trouble. Before she could put her plans into motion, she heard voices outside. Curious, she walked to the window and peeked through the blinds. A group of neighbors stood in the cul-de-sac, laughing and chatting with the farmer. He'd parked his tractor at the edge of the street and was leaning against it, talking animatedly with Officer Dan and a few other residents. The sight of them getting along so easily made her stomach churn. Her frustration grew when she noticed the HOA president among them, shaking the farmer's hand. She couldn't hear the conversation, but from their smiles and nods, she knew it wasn't about removing him. If anything, they were probably welcoming him even more into the community. Karen clenched her fists, feeling utterly betrayed. She'd expected at least a few neighbors to stand with her, but instead they were acting like this tractor-driving nuisance was some kind of town hero. Her anger peaked when she noticed something new. Several houses had put up small decorative signs in their yards featuring images of tractors, some with playful slogans like, "We heart suit our farmers and tractors welcome." It was a direct message to her, a community-wide joke at her expense. They weren't just ignoring her complaints, they were actively celebrating the very thing she'd fought so hard against. Karen slammed her blinds shut and paced the living room, her thoughts racing. No matter what she did, they found a way to dismiss her, to turn her complaints into something laughable. But she refused to accept defeat. There had to be a way to turn this around. Maybe she could still convince the right people to listen. Maybe if she framed it as a bigger issue, beyond just one tractor, she could get traction. She picked up her phone and started drafting an email to a local journalist, spinning the situation as a serious concern about rural invasion into residential spaces and how it was affecting homeowners. She wrote about city folk like herself being ignored in favor of the farming community, claiming suburban areas were being forced to accommodate agricultural life when it should be the other way around. After reading it over twice, she sent it off and sat back, waiting. If she could get a news station or blog to pick up the story, she might turn public opinion in her favor. She imagined reporters showing up at her door, asking for her perspective on the tractor crisis, and envisioned herself giving an eloquent speech about preserving suburban integrity. She smiled at the thought. This wasn't over yet. Days passed, and Karen checked her email obsessively, but nothing came. The one local news outlet that responded politely declined, saying it didn't align with their editorial focus. It was another crushing blow, and her confidence began to slip. Her mood worsened as the farmer continued his routine, driving his tractor down the road every morning, tipping his hat at her house just to annoy her. The worst part was he wasn't even being mean about it. He was just living his life while she stewed in frustration. Then one morning, something unexpected happened. As Karen sipped her coffee, a moving truck pulled up across the street. A family stepped out, a couple and their two young children. She hadn't known the previous owners had sold, but it didn't matter. These were fresh residents, untainted by the town's farm-loving mentality. A renewed sense of determination filled her. This was her chance to get someone on her side before they settled in. Karen grabbed a plate of cookies, plastered on her most welcoming smile, and marched over. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she chirped as the couple turned to greet her. "I'm Karen Thompson, one of your neighbors. I thought I'd say hello." The woman smiled. "That's so kind of you. I'm Emily, and this is my husband, Mark." Karen handed them the cookies and got straight to business. "I just wanted to give you a heads up about something. There's a farmer who insists on driving his tractor through here every day. It's been quite the disturbance." Emily and Mark exchanged glances. "A tractor?" Mark asked, raising an eyebrow. "Is that a big problem?" Karen nodded eagerly. "Oh, absolutely. It disrupts the peace, damages the road, and frankly, it doesn't belong in a nice residential area like this." Emily tilted her head. "Well, we grew up in a small town, so we don't really mind that kind of thing." Karen's smile faltered. "But surely you don't want farm equipment rolling through while your kids are playing." Emily shrugged. "Honestly, I'd rather have a friendly farmer around than a bunch of strict neighborhood rules. It's part of the charm of living here." Karen felt her stomach drop. Another dead end. Weeks later, a for sale sign appeared on her lawn. The neighborhood barely reacted. No one was surprised. As Karen drove away for the last time, the farmer tipped his hat. She scowled and left without looking back.